began with a document no one expected to matter, an inventory meant to list chairs, tapestries, silverware, the everyday backbone of a Gilded Age mansion. Yet the moment its pages slid from the archival box, the air changed. Lines slashed through names, margins carved with frantic strokes, numbers leaping as if entire rooms had been excised from existence. A simple household record had turned into a battlefield of ink and omission, hinting that the Roosevelt estate once held something the family could not afford history to remember. What emerged under the lamp felt less like paperwork and more like a confession interrupted. The pages, brittle from a century of silence, carried uneven handwriting in places where a different clerk should have continued the list. Several entries: Gallery East Alcove, Upper North Storage, and one cryptic notation tied to a sealed wing, were scratched out so deeply the paper thinned to transparency. Entire folios appeared to have been removed. A reference on page 17 to objects enumerated on page 23 led nowhere, because page 23 no longer existed. Even the numbering of artifacts betrayed the violence of revision. 112 flowed to 114 without explanation, as if 113 had been a liability rather than a possession. To understand the rupture, one must first know what an inventory meant in an elite household at the turn of the century. In the gilded mansions of families like the Roosevelts, inventories were legal anchors, precise, unemotional, indispensable for insurance, estate planning, political optics. They cataloged imported portraits, Flemish tapestries, safes holding correspondence, rare mechanical clocks, family silver marked with initials that had survived wars and scandals. Everything had its place, its number, its quiet role in projecting order and refinement. Deviation was not only unusual, it was unacceptable, which makes the Roosevelt document all the more disquieting. Instead of immaculate order, it revealed hesitation, contradiction, fear etched in ink. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Where one expected crisp, accountant-like notation, there were jagged interruptions. Where wealth usually proclaimed itself through meticulous record-keeping, here were erasures aggressive enough to tear fibers from the page. A conservation expert noted that at least 2 hands had worked on the corrections, one steady, deliberate, the other hurried, as if someone had been told to fix the ledger before dawn. And hovering over all of it was the timing. These alterations occurred between 1880 and 1900, precisely when the Roosevelt name was threading itself deeper into national politics. It was an era when a misplaced document, a suspicious donation, or a family dispute could alter the course of an election. Erasing a room might have been easier than explaining what it once contained. So the first true question emerged not from what survived, but from what didn't. Which items were removed with such insistence that even their numbers had to be cut away? Which rooms required invisibility at a moment when the family was navigating alliances, rivalries, and the brutal expectations of public life? And why did the revisions mimic techniques used by political aides of the period, methods meant to protect reputations rather than household assets? The more one studied the inventory, the clearer it became that this was no clerical accident. It was a controlled wound, a curated silence embedded in a mansion that once dictated social rhythms across New York. The inventory was not describing the Roosevelt estate, it was hiding it. Have you ever heard a story like this hidden inside a Gilded Age mansion? If this case reminds you of another sealed room or forgotten heir, share it below. This channel exists to reveal what the elite have tried to erase, so subscribe before you lose sight of it. And as the light skimmed over the torn edge where page 23 should have been, it became impossible to shake the sense that whatever vanished there had been removed in the hope it would never be found again. Yet its shadow remained, waiting to pull us deeper into the Roosevelt labyrinth. The Roosevelt mansion in the final decades of the 19th century rose above its manicured lawns like a verdict. Set on a hill just far enough from the city to command distance yet close enough for influence to flow through its doors, the house was a monument carved from ambition. 3 floors, 36 formal rooms, and a sequence of private corridors known only to staff created a geography designed as much for choreography as for comfort. Guests who arrived on autumn evenings were guided past the marble vestibule into a hall lined with portraits of ancestors whose reputations had been burnished to near myth. The house did not welcome so much as it measured, testing whether a visitor belonged to the upper strata of Gilded Age America. In those years, the Roosevelt name was becoming a political instrument of its own. While fortunes were built through rail interests, banking partnerships, and strategic ties with shipping magnates, the family's public identity was carefully curated. Every appearance at a charity ball, every speech delivered by a cousin entering municipal politics, every investment whispered about in the parlors of Manhattan tightened the web connecting them to the country's emerging power elite. They were not merely wealthy, they were becoming inevitable. And in such an environment, even the architecture of their home functioned as a declaration. Columns imported from Italy, parquet floors laid by craftsmen brought in from Boston, a conservatory that hosted senators one evening and foreign envoys the next. Each feature signaled that this was not a residence, but a stage for the negotiations that shaped the era. Within these walls, alliances were formed in the flicker of gaslight. Industrialists debated tariffs beside a mantel carved with the family crest. Editors of influential newspapers crossed paths with party strategists whose reputations could not survive daylight. The parlor served as a diplomatic zone where favored guests were allowed to drift toward the private library, a room whispered to contain not only rare books, but the family's most delicate correspondences, letters that mingled personal stakes with political leverage. A mansion in the Gilded Age was never simply a home. It was a fortress of perception, a machine built to project stability while veiling all instability within. It is within this context that the damaged inventory gains its unsettling significance. Inventories in grand estates were more than bureaucratic lists. They were proof of continuity, evidence that the dynasty behind the walls lived in impeccable order. They established what belonged to whom, and, more importantly, what stories those possessions silently upheld. A painting placed in the West Gallery meant something. A locked cabinet in the attic meant something else. When the Roosevelt clerk drafted the original list between 1880 and 1881, he was recording not only objects but hierarchy, value, lineage. And when later hands carved through those pages in the 1890s, they were not merely removing items, they were reconfiguring the family's narrative at a moment when that narrative had become dangerously relevant. This was a period when elections were razor thin and scandals could detonate with only a rumor. The Roosevelts, straddling both public service and private fortune, were navigating an environment where personal missteps could echo into national politics. The timing of the rasuras, interruptions in 1884, again in 1892, and finally in 1899, aligns eerily with moments of heightened political tension. A contested gubernatorial race, a banking dispute that threatened to expose internal loans, a quiet family disagreement that newspapers eagerly circled but never managed to name. Those years left fingerprints on the inventory because they left shadows on the family itself. The house absorbed these anxieties. Staff recalled how the atmosphere changed during election cycles. Servants instructed to redirect visitors to specific wings. Fireplaces lit in unused rooms to give the illusion of constant activity. Windows darkened to hide gatherings that were never meant to appear on guest lists. Even the grand staircase, usually a symbol of the home's theatricality, became a channel through which messages were passed discreetly between political aides and family members. A mansion could serve as a vault, and the Roosevelts used theirs with the precision of seasoned strategists. Against that background, the violent edits to the inventory feel less like curiosity and more like strategy. If a ledger could reveal ownership of sensitive documents, or the presence of guests whose names might have jeopardized campaigns, erasing the record was safer than trusting mere silence. The disputed alcove in the East Gallery, the vanished notation tied to the sealed north wing. Each anomaly reflects decisions made behind heavy curtains, decisions weighted by national consequence. The document's wounds echo the pressures that once pulsed through the polished corridors of the house. In a residence where every object seemed to carry the weight of a backroom decision, one question lingers. Would you dare to open an archive that was altered by hands determined never to be identified? The hesitation that grips the researcher today mirrors, in some small way, the tension that must have gripped those who first wielded the knife of revision. They were not preserving a home, they were defending a dynasty. And so the mansion stands in our mind's eye again, gas lamps flickering across lacquered wood, portraits watching from their gilded frames, the hush of a corridor where a page was torn from a book more than a century ago. From this vantage, we can finally turn toward the technical anatomy of those erasures, the pages that vanished, and the choices that shaped the broken inventory we now struggle to decipher. The deeper one moves into the Roosevelt inventory, the more its pages behave like a landscape shaped by hands that feared daylight. The rasuras are not scattered accidents. They form a pattern, almost a topography of anxiety mapped across the paper. Some lines are struck with a single elegant stroke, the sort used by clerks correcting a misplaced comma. Others are obliterated by thick, uneven graphite or ink, the kind that digs into the page as though someone wished to wound the entry itself. In places, words are not removed, but weakened, partially scraped away with a blade, leaving faint ghosts of letters that resist complete disappearance. These differences matter. A careful eye can read the intention not in what survives, but in the violence or delicacy with which an entry was made to vanish. When comparing intact sections with those scarred by revision, the pattern sharpens. Rooms associated with display, parlors, music. Rooms, guest suites, remain almost entirely untouched. Their lists of imported vases, gilded mirrors, and crystal service sets reflect the precision expected of a household trained to project elegance. But when the inventory reaches areas tied to privacy and strategy, the damage multiplies. The library ledger is punctured with missing lines. The notation for a locked cabinet, west wall, is crossed out so heavily that the paper had to be reinforced during conservation. The office wing is worse. Entries for document drawers, desk compartments, and 2 separate safes are interrupted mid-sentence, as if the clerk had begun to describe something he was later instructed to forget. Even the numbering of these items reveals unease, sequence breaks, duplicated digits, annotations added months later in a different ink as though an internal debate had unfolded over what could remain acknowledged. Cross-referencing these irregularities with external materials only complicates the picture. Photograph from 1887 shows the library with 3 cabinets along the north wall. The inventory of the same year mentions only 2. A letter written by a family associate alludes to a folio stored in the Upper East study, yet the study appears in the inventory only as a blank heading with no listed contents. And an auxiliary inventory from 1891, one prepared for insurance valuation, mentions a chest of correspondence sealed and stored in the attic room. In the damaged Roosevelt ledger, that chest appears only in the margin, noted in handwriting so small and hesitant it nearly disappears into the crease. This inconsistency is not simply the result of haphazard clerical work. It is the outcome of deliberate reshaping, an attempt to make the mansion's physical record align with a version of events sculpted after the fact. Historians and archivists know that gaps speak as loudly as entries. In any household, a missing page can be explained by accident, disuse, or the neglect of a board assistant. But in an estate of political stature, gaps acquire weight. They become evidence of intervention, markers of decisions taken with a purpose. The Roosevelt inventory contains too many silences clustered around too many sensitive categories for coincidence to explain them. The fact that only certain rooms, those associated with confidential meetings, private correspondence, or storage of legal and financial materials, show alterations suggests a motive linked not to household management, but to the protection of information. Even the style of correction communicates intent. A redirection note reading "See revised list" appears beside the struck-out entry for the second-floor study, but there is no revised list to be found. Its absence creates an echo, the sense that the revision once existed but was removed with equal precision. In contrast, items tied to mundane maintenance, such as linens and kitchenware, remain untouched, their numbering pristine. Whoever altered the document did not wish to disguise incompetence. They wished to disguise particular truths. The handwriting tells another story. The early entries of the 1880s are firm, almost calligraphic. By the 1890s, layers of corrections overlay the original script, but two distinct hands emerge among the edits. One seems familiar with financial documentation, neat, composed, careful in the erasures. The other is hurried, with strokes that slant unevenly, as if added under instruction rather than understanding. A.G. Historian examining such variations would note that the calmer hand likely belonged to someone with authority, while the rushed corrections could have been made by a clerk under pressure. Together, they form a silent dialogue, the decision to remove and the urgency to comply. This pattern of intervention becomes even clearer when comparing the Roosevelt ledger to inventories from similar estates of the period. In most households, revisions appear in the wake of renovations, thefts, or estate disagreements. But here, the edits cluster around moments tied to the family's political trajectory. The blank section dated shortly after a contentious election challenge. The removed page from the summer when a railroad partnership collapsed under public scrutiny. The overwritten notation from the year a Roosevelt cousin faced an inquiry that never reached trial. The ledger does not merely record the mansion's contents, it mirrors the fluctuations of a dynasty maneuvering between influence and exposure. And so the inventory becomes a kind of palimpsest, a record rewritten to bridge the gap between what happened and what the family needed history to believe. The contradictions between this ledger and other surviving documents are not accidents. They are the residue of decisions crafted in private rooms by people who understood that control of the narrative began with control of the archive. What the inventory hides is not objects but relationships, alignments, vulnerabilities. What it reveals is the architecture of discretion. Interpreting such a document requires reading the spaces where ink refuses to speak. Every archivist knows that omissions cluster around meaning. Every historian knows that a narrative with too many smooth edges was polished by someone with something to lose. The Roosevelt inventory, with its uneven scars and silent corridors of white space, stands as a lesson in how the elite curated their legacies, erasing not chaos, but context. From here, the path leads outward toward the pressures that made such intervention necessary. The political storms, the internal disputes, the looming specter of exposure that threaded through the Roosevelt mansion as the century turned. The next step is to understand not only how the document was altered, but why the family believed those alterations were worth the risk of detection, a question that will draw us further into the rooms where the truth was locked away. The dates of the ink tell a story long before the words do. When archivists laid the Roosevelt inventory alongside a simple timeline of elections and party struggles, the coincidences became too precise to ignore. The first wave of rasuras, those uneasy strokes from the mid-1880s, cluster around a year when a Roosevelt cousin sought higher office on a platform of reform. The second wave, in the early 1890s, coincides with a brutal internal battle inside their own party over tariffs and railroad regulation. The final, almost panicked edits at the close of the decade appear just as the family's ambitions began reaching beyond state politics toward the national stage. Each moment of public exposure left a shadow in the mansion's most private document. In 1884, the inventory shows its first scars. Up to that point, the ledger reads like any other. Parlors detailed, guest rooms itemized, silver sets traced through inheritance. Then the script falters where the library and office wing begin. Entries for correspondence bundles, campaign folios, and a locked tin box, committee use, bear thin lines of ink drawn directly through their descriptions. In the margin, a terse notation appears in a later hand, omitted in revised list. No such revised list survives. That same year, newspaper clippings speak of a Roosevelt relative campaigning on integrity, while rumors of backroom deals circulate without ever crystallizing into formal accusations. The House stayed quiet. The ledger did not. By 1892, the stakes had risen. The Roosevelts were no longer peripheral actors. They were entwined with banks, shipping firms, rail interests, the nervous system of Gilded Age power. Elections were no longer simply about office. They were about the survival of fortunes. Around this period, another layer of edits descends upon the inventory. Objects that once had clear provenance suddenly lose their history. Silver service gift from J.D. at convention becomes silver service, provenance unknown. A painting registered originally as portrait of industrial partner West Wall is overwritten with a bland gentleman in evening dress. The objects remain, but their political intimacy is dismantled, stripped of any hint that campaigns and capital had ever mingled so openly in the Roosevelt halls. This is where domestic life and public power intertwine most dangerously. In the Gilded Age, campaign finances did not move through neat digital ledgers. They flowed through envelopes, private safes, and drawing room agreements. Or, banker's favor might arrive as a painting. A railroad's loyalty might be expressed in bonds tucked into a leather case on a library shelf. A political machine's gratitude could take the form of a jeweled box with a note discreetly burned the next morning. The Roosevelt inventory, in its original form, seems to have acknowledged some of these objects with surprising candor. Too much candor for a family stepping into the brutal theater of Golden Age politics. As the 1890s unfold, the ledger's corrections grow bolder. Entire categories related to committee records, correspondence from party offices, and financial papers held in trust show signs of surgical removal. It is not that the objects themselves vanished overnight. Rather, the paper trail that linked them to specific alliances appears to have been severed. Where another estate might simply list iron safe, contents assorted, the Roosevelt ledger initially attempted to break the safe's interior into sub-items, letters, harbor contract, memorandum on banking arrangement, pledges and receipts, election. Those notations have been attacked with such force that only fragments remain, the ink spread like bruises across the page. The safe, in the end, survives in the inventory only as iron safe, second office, contents private. Seen in this light, the inventory becomes an indirect index of dangerous relationships. What remains named? Neutral objects, decorative symbols, items whose value is aesthetic or sentimental. What disappears? Anything that could, if exposed, sketch a line between the Roosevelt mansion and the more controversial engines of Gilded Age power, contested railroad concessions, exclusive banking syndicates, party bosses whose reputations could topple an administration. The ledger does not confess these ties outright. Instead, it stitches over them, renaming, reclassifying, or erasing until only the silhouette of the original truth is left. It is in the subtle renamings that fear becomes most visible. A chest once described as political correspondence, locked attic room, is later revised to old letters and miscellany. A set of bound volumes labeled Minutes Harbor Committee vanishes entirely, their shelf now occupied, according to the revised hand, by MISC legal tomes. Archivists recognize this cadence. Specific, incriminating language softened into vagueness, as if the inventory itself had become a liability. The house was not only storing power, it was learning how to disguise it. At the same time, the family's public record grows more polished, more carefully stage-managed. A Roosevelt speech praising transparency in government contrasts almost painfully with the ink-deep scratches over the very boxes that once held unfiltered records of negotiation and obligation. Newspaper columns celebrate their disinterested service, while the inventory's margins carry cryptic notes about relocation of sensitive material between the office wing and the north storage rooms. The mansion's polished facade and the ledger's quiet panic are two halves of the same story. To modernize, it is easy to treat a household inventory as inert paperwork. But in the tightrope world of Gilded Age politics, such a document could become a weapon. Imagine a rival gaining access to the list of gifts and private collections, tracing the pattern of who had granted favors and when. A silver centerpiece dated suspiciously close to a key vote. a collection of stock certificates from a company benefits from a legislative exemption signed by a Roosevelt ally. A trunk of correspondence from party officials who later claimed never to have been involved. The ledger, if preserved in its raw state, could have mapped the invisible geometry of obligation that underpinned the family's ascent. That is why the timing of the rasuras matters. They do not occur at random. They arrive like counter-moves on a chessboard. Each time the family edge closer to a position where public scrutiny deepens, the knife returns to the paper. The result is a series of erased records that nonetheless testify to their own erasure. The more the Roosevelts claimed moral clarity in the public arena, the more shadows accumulated between the mansion's walls and its ledgers. For historians, this is the paradox of Golden Age secrets. The attempt to scrub them clean often leaves the sharpest outlines. When a name is crossed out instead of merely omitted, when a category is renamed rather than left blank, the anxiety behind the ink becomes legible. The Roosevelt inventory mirrors a dynasty that understood the cost of exposure. It doesn't reveal the exact content of every forbidden room or sealed coffer, but it proves that such spaces existed and that someone once feared what might happen if they were ever fully mapped. In a house where every object could echo a decision made in smoke-filled rooms, the act of revising an inventory was not clerical housekeeping. It was risk management. One can almost see the scene, the mansion quiet late at night, a lamp burning in the office, a family member or trusted advisor leaning over the ledger with a steady hand, instructing a clerk which lines must vanish and which can remain. Some entries are crossed out with surgical calm. Others are maimed, as if the decision to remove them was contested, even as the ink pressed down. And this is where a question lingers, pressing against the edge of the page. In a house where each listed object might weigh as heavily as a whispered promise or a concealed favor, would you have the courage to enter the archive, knowing that the pages you touched had already been edited by those who did not want to be seen? The inventory becomes a corridor of silent witnesses, each gap a closed door, each renaming a locked drawer. From this intersection of politics and paper, the trail turns inward again. The next layer of the story lies not only in the dates and the ink, but in the physical geography of the mansion, the strategic rooms, the safes embedded into walls, the secluded storage alcoves where documents could be hidden, moved, or quietly removed from the historical stage. Somewhere behind the cold language of the ledger, real metal doors once shut on secrets the Roosevelts refused to entrust to any list at all. On the plans of the Roosevelt mansion, the public rooms bloom like flowers. Sweeping parlors, grand staircases, a ballroom drawn with ornamental flourishes. But when you follow the lines into the administrative heart of the house, the drawing tightens. Walls thicken, corridors narrow, and certain spaces are rendered with an economy that feels almost evasive. It is there, tucked behind the display of privilege, that the true cartography of secrecy begins. The main office occupied a corner of the second floor, overlooking the carriage drive. By day, it presented itself as a gentleman's study. Mahogany desk, glass-fronted bookcases, a pair of leather chairs positioned for conversation rather than confrontation. Yet the inventory hints at another function. Beyond the listed desk, ink grows terse. Cabinet locked, drawer compartment hidden, iron safe, wall. No dimensions, no descriptions of contents, just words that mark the presence of containers rather than what they contained. For a house that cataloged the pattern of its rugs and the provenance of its candlesticks, that brevity feels less like oversight than intent. Adjacent to the office lay the private library, a room the family guarded more jealously than the dining hall. Guests might be invited in on occasion, but only under supervision. Floor-to-ceiling shelves and a rolling ladder suggested an indulgent bibliophile's haven. Yet the inventory's language betrays a more complex reality. Ordinary volumes are itemized with care. Histories, law books, collections of travel journals. Then the rhythm stumbles. A shelf is recorded simply as files boxed. Another as ledgers assorted, and one entire case is summarized as sealed volumes and packets, contents not disclosed. No other part of the mansion uses that phrase. It appears once, in faint ink, and is later struck through with a line so thin it feels symbolic rather than functional, as if someone wanted to show the phrase had been removed without quite letting it vanish. Further inside the house, past a service corridor rarely used by guests, an archival room had been carved out of what was originally designed as an additional bedroom. The inventory mentions it only in passing. Storage, records, crates, cabinets. No room measurements, no window description, nothing to help an outsider imagine the space. But servants' recollections, preserved in letters and second-hand memoirs, describe a chamber lined with metal cabinets bearing keyholes, unlike those used anywhere else in the house. Some cabinets held mundane ledgers, others were rumored to contain contracts, drafts, and letters that never earned official letterhead. On the ledger, these distinctions blur into anonymity. To the eye of an archivist, that homogenizing of detail is itself a red flag. The safes were the most telling features. One, in the main office, appears consistently in all versions of the inventory, its existence acknowledged, but its contents rendered abstract. Another, smaller safe is mentioned only once, in an early notation, secondary safe, library alcove. In later revisions, that line is overwritten with cabinet north wall. The safe had not necessarily been removed from the wall. The word had been removed from the page. Somewhere between the design of the mansion and the reconfiguration of its records, metal doors and plaster were meant to become invisible. Control of these spaces and the keys that governed them was tightly held. In estates of this scale, servants managed linens and pantry stores, but only a tiny circle ever touched the truly sensitive locks. A trusted butler might have carried a ring of keys to doors and wine cellars. The more discreet keys, those to the office safe, the library cabinets, the archive room, tended to rest in a specific desk drawer or remain in the pockets of the family patriarch and his appointed lieutenant. The inventory alludes to this hierarchy obliquely. Key sets, master, butler, office, with the latter crossed out and replaced by private. Those who walked the mansion daily knew that some doors did not appear on the official blueprint, and some walls sounded hollow in ways that suggested hidden compartments. To them, secrecy was an architectural feature as much as an administrative one. As the revisions internal unfolded, it is easy to imagine how these physical structures aided the paper purge. A box of documents once listed in the attic could simply disappear into the archive room without leaving a trace on the official plans. A bundle of letters from a controversial donor could be moved from a desk drawer to a floor safe and then rendered as assorted documents, non-essential in the sanitized inventory. When an entry became too inconvenient to sustain, it was not always the object that vanished, it was its trail. The ink on the page was adjusted, and the content in the room was relocated to a depth where only the most trusted hands could follow. At least once, the process seems to have gone further. A note in the margin of a later page, barely legible, refers to the destruction of outdated materials, per instruction, not to be listed. The handwriting is the same calm, careful script that appears beside other politically sensitive removals. Whatever those materials were, they have left no obvious survivors in the present archive. In a house equipped with fireplaces, incinerators for kitchen refuse, and a staff trained to obey without curiosity, the physical elimination of paper could be as thorough as the erasure of its description in the ledger. Seen from above, the mansion becomes a map of competing truths. Public rooms proclaim one story: stability, refinement, continuity. Administrative spaces whisper another: contingency, strategy, fear. Some rooms, like the main office, sit at the intersection of both worlds, serving as the visible face of an otherwise hidden apparatus. Others exist almost entirely in shadow, mentioned in passing, renamed or transformed into vague storage in the revised inventory. Every corridor that turns a corner without a window, every locked door without a keyhole visible on the plan, suggests a place where information could be sequestered away from official scrutiny. It is here that the inventory's silences align with the house's physical blind spots. The north storage, so heavily edited in the document, corresponds to a wing that guests rarely saw and staff rarely entered unsupervised. The Upper East study, reduced to a heading without listed contents, occupied a space that connected directly to the archive room by a narrow internal passage. A cabinet once described as holding committee papers stands in a corner often cropped out of surviving photographs of the office. These convergences are not definitive proof, but they trace a recognizable pattern. Sensitive material gravitated toward areas of the mansion where architecture and authority combined to keep eyes away. Faced with such a plan, one in which each room seems to hold its own version of the truth, the question becomes uncomfortably personal. Diante. De uma planta em que cada cômodo parece contar uma versão diferente da verdade. Diante dessa informação, você falaria ou se calaria, sabendo quem realmente comandava essas chaves? In a world where losing favor with the Roosevelts could mean losing livelihood, status, or protection, silence was not cowardice, it was survival. The house's walls carried as much weight as its safes. As the 20th century approached and some of the family's ambitions solidified into real political power, the combination of physical and documentary control formed a nearly seamless defense. Rooms could be rearranged, doors sealed, safes emptied or refilled. Inventories could be trimmed, rewritten, or selectively updated. The mansion itself became an accomplice, its corridors and cabinets cooperating with the ink strokes that reshaped the official record. From this structural web, we circle back toward the paper. The internal revisions noted in the margins of the inventory no longer appear as isolated edits. They are moves in a broader strategy, supported by locks, walls, and the careful choreography of access. To understand what those revisions truly did to the Roosevelt story, we now have to focus on their content, the specific categories of information that were targeted, and the phrases that were meticulously replaced, softened, or made to disappear. By the time the phrase internal revision appears in the margin of the Roosevelt inventory, the practice itself is already older than the ink. Among elite families of the Gilded Age, correction of the record was not only permitted, it was expected. Ledgers were brought up to date, correspondence jungly ed, guest books regularized. On the surface, these phrases suggested harmless housekeeping. In reality, they often signaled a deeper operation, the conscious re-engineering of what future eyes would be allowed to see. The past in such houses was not discovered, it was curated. Historically, an internal revision was simple, in form and profound in consequence. A trusted member of the family, or more often a lawyer or private secretary, was tasked with re-evaluating existing documents and adjusting them to align with the narrative the house wished to project. In account books, this could mean smoothing over embarrassing debts or relabeling risky investments as miscellaneous holdings. In guest lists, names that later brought scandal might be discreetly removed, their visits transformed into vague, private meetings. In inventories, the process was subtler but no less deliberate. Descriptions were softened, dates blurred, connections erased. The paper remained. Its meaning changed. The Roosevelt inventory bears the fingerprints of precisely this kind of work. Early entries speak with specificity. 3 boxes, committee correspondence, folio of contracts, harbor improvements, collection of letters from J and Associates pending. These phrases anchor objects to particular events, decisions, and relationships. They make the mansion's contents not only physical but political. In later hands, those anchors are cut. Committee correspondence becomes simply letters. Contracts, harbor improvements, is shortened to legal papers. The collection of letters is reduced to assorted documents. Nothing in these revisions is technically false, yet each one drains context from the record, leaving future readers standing in front of a locked door with no label to suggest what once lay behind it. The difference between a legitimate correction and a manipulative revision lies in intention and in pattern. All households correct their records. A clerk miscounts, a piece of furniture is moved, a safe is replaced, a line is crossed out, a number adjusted. These changes are usually scattered, practical, indifferent to subject matter. In the Roosevelt ledger, however, the edits cluster around specific categories: political papers, financial instruments, gifts with inconvenient origins. It is not the chipped vase or the missing lamp that disappears. It is the box of correspondence tied to a committee, the ledger that once bore a donor's initials, the chest labeled with the name of a company later entangled in controversy. This concentration of erasures reveals motive. The ledger is being protected not from error, but from scrutiny. The Roosevelts were not alone in this. Other great families of the era, railroad dynasties, steel magnates, banking clans, left behind archives that show similar scars, estate books where strike payments are later listed as charitable disbursements, foundation minutes in which early mentions of political clubs are quietly removed in later copies, correspondence collections where certain letters appear only as slips reading "destroyed by order," as if the act of noting the destruction might somehow absolve it. The Gilded Age was an era obsessed with its own image, and those who held power understood that the archive was not merely a mirror, it was a tool. In that larger pattern, the Roosevelt internal revisions take on a chilling clarity. They are not the nervous scribbles of a clerk embarrassed by his own mistakes. They are the measured strokes of someone who knows exactly which threads, if left intact, could be tugged loose by an investigator decades later. Removing dates from certain entries severs the timeline that might connect a gift or payment to a specific vote or contract. Replacing a precise term like campaign fund box with a neutral strong box dissolves the link between private money and public action. Transforming sealed packets from party office into sealed packets various obscures the chain of custody that might once have tied the mansion directly to the machinery of the party. Internal revision, in this sense, becomes less a clerical function and more a strategy of survival. It allows the family to keep their papers, indeed to boast of their meticulous record-keeping, while stripping those records of the sharp edges that could cut them later. To visiting historians or sympathetic biographers, the archive appears intact, even generous. Boxes open, pages turn, inventories are produced on request. Only when one compares versions, cross-checks descriptions, and listens to the rhythm of what is left unsaid does the pattern emerge. The history on offer is one that has already passed through an internal tribunal. For those who study the period, these revisions are both obstacle and evidence. They obscure concrete details, making it harder to reconstruct the precise mechanics of deals, donations, and alliances. At the same time, the very act of alteration confirms that something worth hiding once existed. A blank space where a harmless object might have been would mean nothing. A blank space where a politically charged category used to stand speaks volumes. The Roosevelt ledger, with its careful thinning of language and targeted erasures, is not just a weakened source. It is a record of the fear that shaped it. And from here, the consequences ripple outward. The story we tell about the Gilded Age, about how power moved, how fortunes were intertwined with politics, how reputations were laundered, depends heavily on the documents that survived. When those documents were adjusted from within, our understanding becomes a reconstruction built over concealed voids. Every softened phrase, every removed date, every neutralized description forces us to question what else was smoothed away, and whose legacy was burnished at the expense of truth. Somewhere in the Roosevelt mansion, a hand once paused above a ledger, choosing whether to leave a line intact or cut it from the record. The ink dried, the page was closed, and the house moved on. Now, more than a century later, we are left with the aftermath, a neat column where something jagged once stood, a word replaced by another that means almost the same thing but not quite, a date rubbed into oblivion. In the quiet of the archive, under the dim light that catches each indentation in the paper, the ledger lies open, its altered lines as still and opaque as a locked door at the end of a darkened hallway. The Roosevelt inventory begins to fracture the moment it meets anything outside its own pages. On its own, the ledger insists on calm, neat columns, measured handwriting, a controlled erosion of detail, but lay beside it a stack of letters, a photograph album, a folder of yellowed newspaper, clippings, and the facade wavers. The house described in the inventory and the house glimpsed through other sources are recognizably the same structure, same grand stair, same library, same gallery walls, yet they do not quite inhabit the same reality. Take, for instance, a photograph from the late 1880s, the main library, captured during a winter reception. In the background, partially obscured by guests, stands a tall cabinet in the corner, its glass doors reflecting lamplight. Inside, one can just make out rows of bound volumes, all of the same height, their spines marked not with titles but with simple dates: 1881, 1882, 1883. A handwritten note on the back of the photograph identifies them as committee minutes and correspondence, kept privately. The inventory from that same year, however, lists only cabinet, glass front, contents, assorted books. By the 1890s, the cabinet remains in the room, but in the revised ledger it has become simply cabinet, library, contents general. The dates vanish. The words minutes and correspondence evaporate. The visual record insists on specificity. The written record retreats into fog. Newspaper reports deepen the tension. A clipping from a local paper describes a post-election gathering at the Roosevelt mansion. In the Upper East study, it is said, papers were signed that will determine the city's course for years. That phrase, Upper East study, matches a heading in the inventory exactly. Yet beneath the heading, no contents are listed. No furniture, no documents, not even a rug. The room exists just enough to be acknowledged, but not enough to be accountable. To the public, it was a place of decisive signatures. To the ledger, it is an empty name. Auction records create another layer of contradiction. Decades later, when some of the Roosevelt possessions are dispersed, catalogs list items that the final version of the inventory never admits. A silver centerpiece, presented by Harbor Syndicate 1884, appears in a sale. Description: its inscription carefully recorded. In the mansion's ledger, the closest match is a generic silver centerpiece, origin not specified. A set of framed documents bearing the seals of a major bank and a political club are auctioned as Roosevelt Estate memorabilia. In the inventory, no such framed documents are ever mentioned. Somewhere between the house's active years and its liquidation, the objects remained real enough to be sold, but abstract enough on paper to avoid raising questions while their owners were still alive. Private correspondence is even less forgiving. Letters between family members refer to the locked chest in the attic, where all of Father's campaign notes and unfortunate letters are kept. Another warns, during a particularly heated political dispute, if they ever see what's in the north storage room, none of us will hold office again. Yet in the inventory, the attic chest appears only once, early on, as wooden chest, old letters, various. In later revisions, it disappears entirely. The north storage room, so ominous in the letter's tone, is reduced to misc boxes and trunks. Against the urgency of lived experience, the ledger's language feels almost mocking. These discrepancies are not scattered accidents. They form what might be called spaces of maneuver. Where the ledger falls silent, the family gains room to move. An item that is never clearly recorded cannot be clearly demanded by auditors, journalists, or hostile relatives. A room that is acknowledged but left undescribed can be anything to those who use it and nothing to those who question it. In this sense, the inventory's omissions function as a kind of shield. What is not written does not have to be explained. The Roosevelts understood, as many of their peers did, that silence is a language in itself. When that silence consistently gathers around certain themes, campaign documents, sensitive financial instruments, gifts from controversial allies, it ceases to be neutral. It becomes a statement. This will not be discussed. The repetition of that statement across different documents in different forms is one of the clearest signs of deliberate narrative management. The letters may joke darkly about burning the evidence. The newspapers may speculate about what was signed in which room. The auction catalogs may flaunt what is now safe to display. But the inventory's task, increasingly, is to stand at the center of it all and say, nothing unusual here. For historians, these gaps are infuriating and invaluable at once. They obscure the details most needed to reconstruct the fine grain of Gilded Age power, yet they highlight exactly where the pressure was greatest. When a timeline built from newspapers, letters, and photographs insists on the presence of a certain box, a certain cabinet, a certain set of ledgers, and the inventory either renames them into vagueness or erases them entirely, the contour of the missing truth becomes visible. The empty spaces in the ledger are not random voids. They are negative impressions of what others, elsewhere, remembered all too clearly. This is where the Roosevelt inventory stops behaving like a simple household tool and starts behaving like a crafted narrative. Its contradictions with external sources are not just errors. They are editorial choices. Every softened phrase widens the distance between what happened and what can be proven. Every vanished object leaves a faint outline where another document insists it once stood. Over time, these divergences accumulate, not only obscuring individual events, but warping the overall shape of the story. From this vantage, the question of what really happened becomes more fragile, more contested. The inventory, once assumed to be an anchor of fact, reveals itself as one more voice in a chorus, carefully tuned to avoid discord. The letters and photographs, raw and unedited, pull in another direction. Newspaper clippings add their own bias. Auction records their own retrospective gloss. Somewhere between these overlapping, conflicting layers, the truth of the Roosevelt Mansion and its role in the Gilded Age is suspended, partial, fractured, glimpsed in reflections. The impact is not confined to one family. When a document as central as an inventory can be shaped from within, the entire notion of a stable historical record begins to tremble. The past becomes something negotiated, translated, filtered through the anxieties of those who knew they would one day be judged. The Roosevelts did not merely inhabit history. They edited it as they went. As the last document is laid back beside the ledger, the photograph, the letter, the brittle newsprint, the room in which you read them seems to darken. The items that should align do not. The dates that should match refuse to. On the inventories page, a simple line waits. Cabinet, contents general. In the photograph, the same cabinet stands with its ranks of dated binders, their spines catching the light like vertebrae. The mismatch hangs there, quiet and unnerving, like a locked door that appears clearly in one account and vanishes in another, leaving only the outline of where it should be. Someone, at some precise moment, had to decide that certain lines in the Roosevelt inventory were no longer safe. The ink did not move on its own. Behind every erasure, every softened phrase, there was a person with enough authority to call the past into question, and enough fear to do it in the dark. In a house as hierarchized as the Roosevelt Mansion, the circle of people capable of ordering such internal revisions was remarkably small. A junior clerk might hold the pen, but not the power. That belonged to a senior family member, a trusted attorney whose loyalty had already been tested, or an administrator whose career and survival were bound to the fortunes of the dynasty. These were the hands that could look at a ledger and see not a list of objects, but a map of vulnerabilities. Within that inner circle, each role carried its own way of controlling the story. A family patriarch could simply decree that certain matters were not to be recorded, turning living reality into instant absence. A lawyer, steeped in the logic of liability, might comb through the inventory line by line, spotting phrases that could be dangerous in a courtroom or scandalous in a newspaper column. A discreet accountant might be asked to generalize the language of specific entries, transforming pointed references into bland categories under the pretense of standardization. The butler, if he ever saw the process unfold, would understand that his silence was part of the structure, as critical as any key on his ring. Together, they shaped the mansion's paper trail in ways that left no signature, only erased records and vanished details. The motivations that guided their pens were not abstract. For a family like the Roosevelts, reputation was currency as tangible as stock certificates. A single exposed letter could suggest a conflict of interest. A recorded gift at the wrong moment might look like a bribe. A list of visitors preserved too faithfully could map alliances that were never meant to be made public. During moments of political crisis, when elections grew unpredictable or investigations loomed, the temptation to tighten the archive must have been overwhelming. Protecting the ledger meant protecting campaigns, fortunes, marriages, and a carefully polished public image that presented the Roosevelts as paragons of Gilded Age virtue instead of players in its shadow game. Some revisions were preventive, anticipating questions that had not yet been asked. Others were reactive, born from the terror of realizing that the evidence already lay in ink and could not be easily disavowed. When a scandal surfaced in the press, it was not only the drawing rooms that stirred. Somewhere in the administrative heart of the mansion, someone looked at the shelves and thought of what might be seized, subpoenaed, or leaked. The internal revisions we now read in the inventory are the quiet aftermath of those calculations, as if the house itself had flinched and tried to cover its tracks. What makes this more than a family drama is the asymmetry at its core. Ordinary citizens of the era left traces in documents they did not control: birth registers kept by churches, court records written by clerks, tenancy agreements and debt ledgers stored in, offices far from their reach. Their lives were observed, measured, and filed away in systems designed by others. They could not cross out a line in a police report or soften the language in a tax ledger. The Roosevelts and their peers, by contrast, stood at the center of a private archive they owned outright. They chose which letters to preserve, which guest lists to keep, which inventories to revise. They commissioned authorized histories and edited memoirs that cast their role in the Gilded Age in flattering light, while inconvenient details were relegated to missing papers and lost records. This is the quiet privilege of power, not only to act, but to decide how those actions will be remembered, or whether they will be remembered at all. A clerk in a factory might be dismissed and forgotten. A Roosevelt could have the record of a bad decision gently removed from the shelf. Over time, this creates a striking imbalance in the historical record. The poor and the marginal become visible primarily when institutions choose to record them: arrests, hospitalizations, wage disputes, while the elite appear through documents they curated themselves. The result is an archive tilted in favor of those who already had every advantage, one in which Gilded Age secrets are carefully filtered and Golden Age reputations polished to a gleam. Within that tilted archive, the pen in the Roosevelt mansion wielded a kind of invisible legislative power. It determined which relationships would still be legible a century later, which alliances could be denied with a straight face, which objects could be displayed as harmless heirlooms without revealing the backroom deals they once symbolized. A chest of correspondence becomes miscellaneous papers, severing its link to a charged campaign. A painting given as payment for a political favor is recast as a gift from a family friend, stripping away the transactional undercurrent. Each adjustment does more than protect the family. It reshapes the raw material from which future historians, journalists, and biographers will attempt to reconstruct the past. The ethical weight of that choice is immense. When those at the top of society edit their own records, they are not merely protecting themselves, they are influencing what a country can know about its own formation. Decisions made in the Roosevelt mansion did not stay within its walls. They touched contracts, appointments, regulations, and public narratives of reform and progress. If the paper trail of those decisions is trimmed, smoothed, or partially burned, the story of the era that survives is necessarily incomplete. The dark legacy of such editing is that generations later, we are left debating shadows instead of studying evidence, piecing together Golden Age secrets from hints in the margins. and so the question ceases to be academic. When the history of a country runs, in part, through documents that were edited inside a single house, what would you do if you found something like this buried in the Gilded Age? Would you treat the inventory as a sacred relic, respecting the narrative the family left behind? Or would you read every erasure as a challenge, a quiet dare to look past the polished page and imagine what someone once wanted desperately to hide? That choice, between accepting the official version and interrogating it, is the only power available to those who come after. In the Roosevelt case, the survivors of this editorial regime are paradoxical objects, a ledger that both reveals and conceals, letters that hint at chambers the inventory leaves empty, photographs that confirm cabinets the list refuses to describe. Each source becomes a witness testifying against the others. The fact that the family could orchestrate such contradictions tells us as much about their reach as any act of philanthropy or public office. Their control extended not only over land and labor, but over memory itself. Yet even for families of their stature, control was never absolute. Some documents slipped through the cracks: a duplicate ledger stored off-site, a servant's journal, a forgotten legal copy lodged in a bank's archive. These unplanned survivals now stand like cracks in the polished facade, letting in thin, sharp beams of light. Through them, we see not only the Roosevelts, but a broader pattern shared by other dynasties, rail tycoons, banking houses, studio moguls in the later golden age of Hollywood, who all, in their turn, tried to script what the future would believe about them. The Roosevelt inventory, with its curated blanks and carefully dulled edges, is therefore more than a damaged list. It is a case study in the politics of the archive, in how hidden heirs, forbidden rooms, and silent witnesses can be managed long after the doors are closed and the servants dismissed. Somewhere in those pages, a hand once hovered over a line, considering whether to let it stand or strike it through. The nib descended, the word darkened, then disappeared beneath a cross-hatched veil. The page dried, the book was closed, and the mansion settled back into quiet, leaving behind, in that single stroke, a question that still hangs over the record like a shadow about to move. Once you learn to recognize the handwriting of fear on paper, the Roosevelt inventory stops looking unique. It becomes one tile in a mosaic of Gilded Age silence. Other mansions, other dynasties, left behind archives that breathe in the same broken rhythm. A confident first draft of history, followed years later by careful thinning, missing pages, and the soft blur of words that used to mean something sharper. The Roosevelts did not invent the art of revising the past from inside their own walls. They were simply very good at it. In the records of a railroad dynasty, preserved in a Midwestern historical society, an early ledger of campaign donations survives with a note in the back. Copied in fair hand, original destroyed. The fair hand copy lists modest, respectable sums and a discreet, limited circle of donors. But a single loose sheet, misfiled in another box, preserves a piece of the original, numbers higher, names more controversial, a few annotations in the margin that tie donations directly to pending legislation. The family's later history celebrates their civic generosity. The torn edge of the older list whispers another story, then falls quiet where the page has been ripped. Another archive belonging to a banking family whose name still adorns stone facades holds a run of diaries spanning 3 generations. The earliest volumes are intimate and unsparing. Notes on risky loans, mentions of uncomfortable letters from Washington, references to the steel men and the railroad crowd that sound less like society gossip and more like strategy. Then suddenly the tone shifts. The pages from a critical decade are rewritten in a smoother, more detached voice. Phrases recur that feel strangely formal, as if dictated. We have always sought the greater good. Our involvement has been overstated. Under strong light, faint indentations on some pages suggest earlier writing scraped away. The diaries still exist, but they have already been edited once before reaching the archive, their rough edges sanded down by a descendant who preferred hagiography to confession. Letters tell similar tales. In the papers of a shipping magnate, bundles of correspondence from the 1870s and 1880s survive, in careful order, until a gap appears precisely where a labor dispute and a Senate investigation overlapped. A penciled note in a later hand marks the absence. Certain letters removed for reasons of discretion. No explanation, no apology, just an acknowledgement that the record has been pruned. In another family's collection, a housekeeper's memoir notes that trunks of papers were burned on the instructions of the second Mrs. just after rumors of a financial scandal began to circulate. She recalls standing in the courtyard, watching pages curl and blacken in the flames, while upstairs windows remained resolutely shuttered. The tools of erasure differ, but the pattern repeats. Paginas are encadas, margins where a date once stood now smeared into nothing. Inventories where stocks in X company become investments various. Guest books where certain names are inked over so heavily that the page buckles. These archives carry the same scar tissue as the Roosevelt inventory. Revised. Copies. Fair drafts. Condensed records. The language of housekeeping becomes a veil for something else. Golden Age secrets being adjusted until they fit more comfortably in the public imagination. Generations later, the cleanup often intensifies. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren, raised on family lore and anxious to protect a brand that now appears in school textbooks and museum plaques, open the old boxes and perform what they consider a necessary mercy. They are the ones who write, destroyed by request on envelopes, who select which letters may be donated to a university and which should remain in private hands. They inherit not the guilt of the original actions, but the responsibility for the family's dark legacy. For them, doing the right thing sometimes means making sure that certain wrong things can never be fully proven. When you place these archives side by side, the railroad ledgers, the banker's diaries, the shipping correspondence, the Roosevelt inventory, the similarities are almost eerie. The same kinds of items fade first. Political correspondence, financial instruments tied to controversial ventures, gifts with inscriptions that tie them to specific votes or contracts, papers from committees and clubs that operated in the gray zones between public office and private power. The same generic language replaces sharper terms, accounts, papers, various documents, miscellany. The same justifications appear in the margins and cover letters. Irrelevant, no longer needed, of a personal nature. Underneath those euphemisms lies a shared calculation. If the exact detail disappears, so does the obligation to explain it. The Roosevelt case fits this pattern so precisely that it feels almost like a manual. We see the first draft where rooms and safes are named, where boxes of committee papers and harbor contracts stand openly in the columns. Then we watch as a later hand passes through, converting those sharp edges into soft phrases, crossing out entire lines, removing pages that point too directly at the machinery of power behind the family's rise. It is not the only example of such work, but it is one of the clearest, because enough alternative sources survive to make the manipulation obvious. Letters, photographs, auction records, and external files all point to objects and documents that the inventory later pretends never existed or never mattered. In that gap between what the house contained and what the house admitted, you can see the process of buying a more convenient past. What the Roosevelts did with their ledger is mirrored in other houses, on other hills, behind other iron gates. Some families paid reputable historians to produce authorized biographies, supplying them with archives that had already been cleaned. Others endowed foundations and universities, donating carefully selected pieces of their papers to shape how future generations would study them. A grant here, a chair in business, ethics there, and the narrative begins to tilt. The same men who ordered strikes broken and contracts manipulated reappear as visionaries, philanthropists, builders of the modern world. The missing letters, the revised inventories, and the lost diaries rarely make it into the footnotes. This is the larger pattern that makes the Roosevelt inventory more than a curiosity. It is not just a damaged list in an old house. It is a case study in how hidden heirs, forbidden rooms, and silent witnesses can be managed across an entire class. The same structural privilege that allowed these families to accumulate wealth also gave them control over their own paper trail. They could decide which documents would live and which would die, which would speak plainly and which would be forced into the bland vocabulary of miscellaneous records. Ordinary people in the same era left behind fragments in police logs and hospital registers they never saw. The elite left behind archives they had already edited, curated, and sometimes purged. In that sense, the Roosevelts are exemplary not because they were uniquely ruthless, but because their particular combination of ambition, political entanglement, and meticulous record-keeping produced one of the clearest fingerprints of the process. The razored inventory is not a singular outrage. It is a rare moment when we catch the mechanism in mid-motion, with enough surviving evidence around it to trace how the erasures were done and why. It exposes the method by which a dynasty can smooth its own history, one line at a time, until scandal becomes rumor and rumor becomes silence. Once you see this, it becomes harder to trust any unblemished narrative of the Gilded Age. How many of the stories we accept about self-made men, pure reformers, and benevolent captains of industry rest on archives that were, at some point, subjected to the same quiet surgery? How many erased records hide behind the gloss of official biographies, behind carefully curated museum exhibits and family-funded documentaries that dwell on philanthropy while skimming past the rough years, the panics, the strikes, the contested elections? The Roosevelt papers do not answer these questions, but they sharpen them. Have you ever watched a historical film or read a sweeping novel about this era and felt that certain rooms were never entered, certain questions never asked? That sense of absence is not an accident. It mirrors, in culture, the same absences that appear in the documents. Cinema and literature have long been drawn to the shine of the mansions, the roulette of fortunes, the romance of ballrooms and scandals in love. They rarely show the archive room where pages were torn, the study where a family member sat late at night deciding which letters would survive the next generation. Those scenes exist in the shadows, implied but seldom depicted. From the Roosevelt mansion's broken inventory, the view widens. Across a continent of great houses, across safes embedded in paneled walls, across diaries rewritten in a careful later hand. The pattern repeats like a design in wallpaper, muted, decorative, easy to miss unless you stand very close. And just beyond the edge of those private edits lies another stage entirely, one of spotlights and studio sets, where the Gilded Age would later be rebuilt for audiences with no idea how many documents had already been thinned before the cameras ever rolled. Somewhere between the real ledgers and the filmed versions of history. A door stands half open, its brass label polished to a generic shine, while inside, a stack of crossed-out names lies waiting in the dark. On screen, the Gilded Age rarely smells of ink and scorched paper. It glows. Chandeliers scatter light over polished floors. Orchestras swell as couples turn beneath painted ceilings, and the mansions that once hid ledgers and locked safes become backdrops for romance, not risk management. When Hollywood's golden age turned its gaze backward to those decades of rail barons and society queens, it chose the glittering rooms, the dramatic love affairs, the noble conflicts over inheritance. The archive room, with its metal cabinets and crossed-out lines, almost never made it into the frame. Classic films set in another grander time give us the familiar images: a stern patriarch at the head of a dining table, a rebellious heir, perhaps a scheming cousin whispering on a staircase. Estates are threatened by changing fortunes, by unsuitable marriages, by the moral growth of a hero who learns that money cannot buy happiness. But the machinery that actually sustained those fortunes, the secret committees, the private safes, the internal revisions of ledgers and inventories, stays politely off stage. If documents burn, they do so in one neat scene. A jilted lover drops a letter into a fireplace. A repentant businessman destroys a single contract to do the right thing. the slow, systematic thinning of an owl. Archive over years is far less cinematic and far more dangerous. Hollywood learned early that audiences would accept almost any brutality of emotion before they would follow the dull terror of bureaucracy. It was easier to dramatize a ruined ball than a corrupted balance sheet. Easier to show a love triangle than a pattern of disappearing records. Studios themselves were becoming new empires, with their own golden age secrets and their own need to manage public narratives. Perhaps it was no accident that their historical epics smoothed over the very practices they were quietly perfecting in their own publicity departments. Selective omission, controlled biography, the careful staging of what the world was allowed to see. In these films, when a mansion hides something, it is usually a person or a scandal of the heart. A hidden heir, an illegitimate child, a forbidden romance. The camera moves through forbidden rooms looking for tears and embraces, not for boxes of committee, correspondence, or safes labeled campaign papers. The idea that a family might edit its own past with the same deliberation it edits its guest list rarely appears. The closest we often get is a line about destroying the evidence delivered with a flourish, followed by a conveniently complete resolution. The messy truth, that evidence is more often eroded than obliterated, that records are adjusted in small, deniable increments, is harder to condense into a single scene. Yet the Roosevelt inventory, sitting in its archival box, belongs to the world those films claim to depict. It is one of the things the camera almost never shows. A thick volume of neat script slowly invaded by second thoughts. No string section rises as a hand crosses out a line. No tracking shot glides along the columns of ink. The tension is quieter but colder. A single word, contracts, becoming papers. A phrase, harbor committee minutes, reduced to bound volumes. A safe that once held election funds, now described only as storage, private. These adjustments do not make for a dramatic reveal. They make for a documentary void. That void is precisely what glossy portrayals help to protect. By turning the Gilded Age into an aesthetic, silk gowns, marble foyers, tragic romances, culture invites us to admire the surface and accept it as the whole. If there are villains, they are personal. A cruel father, an ambitious social climber, a heartless tycoon who will, by the final reel, either fall or find redemption. Systems of power, networks of influence, the deliberate engineering of memory through archives and inventories, that architecture of control is rarely given a face, let alone a storyline. It's tempting to see this as harmless nostalgia, but it has consequences. The more the era is remembered as a backdrop for ballrooms and whispered proposals, the easier it becomes to forget that it was also a laboratory for techniques of narrative control. Families like the Roosevelts were not just throwing parties. They were learning how to script their own past in real time. They refined the practice of authorized histories long before studios perfected the authorized biopic. They discovered that if you remove the right pages and rename the right boxes, future storytellers will have no choice but to build their plots around what remains. The razured inventory of the Roosevelt mansion is, in that sense, an anti-film. There are no glamorous speeches here, no sweeping shots of the facade. Instead, the drama is embedded in the mundane, the way certain entries cluster around politically sensitive years, the way the language dulls precisely where other sources grow sharp. It represents the sort of episode that doesn't fit easily into a classic narrative arc. No single villain, no single climactic scene, just a long series of private decisions taken with a pen, each one shaving away a sliver of what later generations might know. Imagine for a moment a different kind of period film, one that opens not on a ball, but on a dimly lit office in the Roosevelt mansion. No music, only the scratch of a pen. A family member and a lawyer lean over the inventory, deciding which lines to strike, which terms to soften. Intercut those scenes with the later Hollywood productions that turned such houses into stages for sentimental drama. The contrast is jarring. On one screen, ink. On the other, illusion. Both are rewriting the same era, but only one leaves visible scars on paper. The romanticization of the Gilded Age in culture is not necessarily a coordinated conspiracy. It is, however, a convenient arrangement. Families that already altered their archives benefit when the broader story of their time is told in broad strokes and sparkling images. The absence of scenes involving rasuras, forged reconciliations in memoirs, or deliberate destruction of records is part of the same quiet process that kept those practices out of the public eye for so long. What isn't shown begins to feel like it never existed. The Roosevelt ledger, with its broken numbering and its empty references to pages that no longer exist, stands as a stubborn counterpoint. It insists that behind every ballroom scene there was a storage room, behind every moral speech there was a safe, behind every grand staircase there was at least one locked door that did not appear on the official plans. The glamour we inherited from film and fiction is not exactly false, but it is incomplete. It shows the golden halls without the hands that turned the pages in secret rooms below. By the time the lights rise in the theater and the credits roll, the viewer has been given a version of the era that feels full, rich, tragic, satisfying. The archivist, lifting the cover of the Roosevelt inventory decades later, encounters the opposite sensation: full pages that feel hollow, a history that has been curated into something smooth where it was once jagged. The gap between those two experiences, between fiction and archive, is where the real work now lies. From here, the story shifts again, away from studio sets and back into the quiet, fluorescent-lit rooms where damaged documents are read and reread. The era that cinema polished into legend is being reopened, line by hesitant line, by researchers tracing missing numbers, by conservators lifting erased words under ultraviolet light, by historians comparing one family's curated memory against the fragmented testimonies of others. Where film folded the Gilded Age into a closed narrative, the archive pries it back open, and in the faint impressions left beneath Roosevelt ink, something long suppressed begins, slowly, to reappear. By the time the Roosevelt inventory reaches our hands, it is less a book than a patient. Its spine is fragile, its pages discolored, its ink fading to the color of dried leaves. Yet in the quiet of a conservation lab, the ledger begins a second life. Gloves, not white gloves of servants, but of archivists, lift each sheet under the steady light of lamps designed to reveal what the eye alone cannot see. The same document that was once manipulated to close questions is now opened, line by hesitant line, to see how many of those questions can be revived. The work starts with the basics: paper, ink, pressure. Conservators examine the stock, noting which pages belong to the original binding and which were inserted later. Tiny differences in texture and watermark mark the points where the record was physically disturbed. Under raking light, scratches and indentations that never received ink become visible. Words that were written and then scraped away, leaving only their ghosts. The rasuras, so definitive to the naked eye, soften under magnification. What once looked like pure black lines resolve into layers, an original word, then a stroke of darker ink, sometimes even a second attempt to blot out a faint survivor beneath. Chemical analysis of the ink reveals more than color. Different formulations introduced at different times let specialists map the chronology of interference. The first hand used a consistent iron gall ink. Decades later, another hand returned with a different mixture, slightly more viscous, slightly more glossy when seen at an angle. Where these inks overlap, the older writing can sometimes be coaxed back into view using multispectral imaging. In certain wavelengths, the top layer fades and the lower reappears, like a submerged structure, glimpsed beneath dark water. A line that now reads "sealed packets" various shows traces of earlier letters that suggest sealed packets from committee office. It is not proof, but it is a direction. Digital tools extend what eyes and lenses can do. High-resolution scans of each page allow researchers to zoom in on the faintest impressions, to adjust contrast until the tiniest variation in fiber becomes meaningful. Software trained to detect patterns in handwriting distinguishes between the clerk's steady script and the later, careful revisions, tagging each occurrence so that a timeline of edits emerges almost like a second invisible index. Once digitized, the inventory can be compared against other documents at a speed no human alone could manage. A phrase scribbled in a family letter, a term used in a banker's ledger, a notation in an external audit. All can be searched and cross-referenced against the ledger's softened vocabulary, revealing where euphemism has overwritten something sharper. Even the absences are analyzed. Where a page has been torn out, the remaining fibers along the spine carry clues about the thickness and age of what is missing. In rare cases, a faint transfer of ink from a facing page gives hints of words that once pressed against it. Elsewhere, small fragments lodged deep in the binding can be recovered, like archaeological sherds. One such sliver in the Roosevelt ledger preserves only a few letters and a date, but together they align suspiciously with a known year of political upheaval, a year when the family, publicly serene, was privately shoring up its alliances. Despite all this, the work is not magic. Many lines remain stubbornly closed, their original text too thoroughly obliterated or gone with the missing page. No spectrum of light can resurrect ashes. Some boxes listed only in early copies of the inventory have vanished completely. Some letters referred to in correspondence left no duplicates behind. Here is the harsh arithmetic of historical reconstruction. No matter how advanced the technology, there are voids that refuse to yield. The Roosevelts and their allies did not rely solely on ink to protect themselves. They burned, shredded, scattered. Against that, 21st century methods can only do so much. Historians working with such partial recoveries learn a particular kind of patience and a particular kind of frustration. They come to accept that a phrase like Harbor Committee may never be fully restored where it has been scraped away, that the full list of names behind donors various may remain perpetually out of reach. They live in the space between knowing that something has been hidden and being unable to prove exactly what. Serious work in this light is less about discovering definitive answers than about narrowing the field of possibility, building plausible reconstructions from the fragments that remain, and being honest about the gaps that cannot be bridged. Yet those fragments matter. Each partially recovered word, each alignment of dates, each rediscovered copy acts as a small rebellion against the intention of the internal revision. The ledger was altered so that future readers would see a smooth, harmless story. The restorers and archivists who now probe its layers insist on seeing the roughness beneath. Simply by placing the damaged inventory side by side with letters, photographs, legal records, and external ledgers, they undo part of the work the Roosevelts thought they had finished. Where the family hoped to present a single authoritative narrative, the modern researcher assembles a chorus of contradictory voices, letting one document expose the evasions of another. Digital publication multiplies that effect. Once scanned and annotated, the Roosevelt inventory can be consulted far beyond the quiet room where it physically lies. Students, researchers, and the merely curious can zoom in on the same rasuras, read the same cryptic marginalia, and compare them against other sources around the world. The document, once jealously guarded inside a mansion and then buried in a specialized archive, is drawn into a broader conversation. Every new pair of eyes has the potential to notice a pattern others missed. A repeated phrase, a familiar hand, a date that aligns with events in a different family's papers. The ledger stops being a private shield and becomes a public puzzle. There is an irony in this. A book once revised to restrict access now survives in a form that invites scrutiny. To reopen a razured inventory is to reverse, symbolically if not completely, the act that sought to close it. Each click that enlarges a blurred word, each cross-reference that ties an innocuous cabinet to a politically charged meeting, is a small act of resistance against the idea that the elite get to decide, forever, what history is allowed to see. The Roosevelts may have wielded the pen, but they no longer hold the only copy. Still, the limits remain stubborn and sobering. Some questions will never move beyond the realm of inference. We may suspect that a particular box held incriminating correspondence. We may even recover enough letters from other sources to outline what that correspondence likely said. But the exact words exchanged in a specific moment, in a specific room, may be gone forever. The unknowns are not failures of method. They are enduring reminders of the power those earlier decisions still exert. Every missing page is a victory for the hand that tore it out, even as the torn edge betrays the act. For those who commit to this work, confronting that reality is part of the discipline. They learn to live with unresolved tension, to tell stories that end not in triumph, but in carefully marked uncertainty. The goal is no longer to produce a perfectly sealed narrative that explains everything, but to expose the mechanisms by which explanation was once constrained. In that sense, the restoration of the Roosevelt inventory is as much about revealing the shape of the manipulation as it is about recovering the content that manipulation tried to hide. In the end, the ledger lies open under a cool light, its pages held flat by gentle weights. On one line, a phrase once entirely obliterated now shows the faintest trace of letters under the cross-hatching. Nearby, a note in the margin confirms that something was removed per instruction. Across the room, a screen displays a digital scan of the same page, zoomed in until the fibers of the paper look like a landscape. Beside it, a researcher compares dates from another family's archive, following a thread that might connect two houses, two safes, two sets of internal revisions. Reabrir esse inventário rasurado, literally, physically, symbolically, is to refuse the finality that the family tried to impose on its own story. The book will never give everything back, but it no longer has the right to refuse the questions. From here, the path leads toward a conclusion that cannot neatly resolve the mystery, but can insist that the official memory of the elite is not the only version that matters, and that every erased line, every missing page, is an invitation to keep asking who benefits when history is allowed to fade. In the end, we are left with a household document that refuses to behave like one. A ledger that should have been boring on purpose, rows of objects, rooms, numbers, now speaks loudest in its absences. The Roosevelt Mao. Inventory was designed to track furniture, tapestries, boxes, and cabinets. Instead, it has become a map of erasures, pages that were cut away with care, descriptions that no longer match what we can see in photographs, dates that drained from the lines just as the family's public influence reached its peak. Nothing in these pages gives us a single explosive revelation. There is no confession hidden in a margin, no smoking gun circled in red. What we have instead is method, a pattern of ink that narrows precisely around the places where power once moved. Safes that become cabinets, committee papers that turn into miscellaneous documents, a study that the newspapers knew as a crucible of decisions appearing in the ledger as an empty heading. The inventory crossed a century because someone expected it to be harmless. It survives as evidence that it was not. If the Roosevelts could bend the record of their own house, they could bend, in small and careful increments, the way their era would remember them. And if they could do it, so could others. This case is not remarkable because one family tried to step through history without leaving footprints. It is remarkable because, here, the mud on their boots still shows. Most dynasties of the Gilded Age left us archives that seem stable, complete, respectable. The Roosevelt ledger reminds us that complete may only mean successfully cleaned. That is where the real weight of this story lies. Not only in what we manage to recover, half-seen words under rasuras, mismatched descriptions, a torn fragment wedged in a binding, but in what the whole process forces us to ask about every other intact collection. How many inventories were revised more efficiently? How many diaries were recopied without leaving traces of the original drafts? How many safes were emptied before anyone thought to write down what they contained? The Roosevelt case doesn't close a mystery, it opens a corridor of them. Standing before this ledger now, we are not offered certainty. We are offered a choice. We can accept the official story of the Gilded Age, its marble halls, its philanthropic speeches, its polished family legends. Or we can look for the places where ink grew nervous, where rooms on the blueprint have no contents, where an ordinary domestic list suddenly behaves like a shield. One path preserves the comfort of a finished narrative. The other remains unresolved, uncomfortable, but closer to how power actually works, when it thinks no one is watching. If you want to keep examining what the elite tried to erase from their own records, stay with these stories. Leave your thoughts, your questions, your own connections below. Every new set of eyes changes how these erased records read. And if you're willing to step further into the halls where pages were torn and names were crossed out, the next inventory, the next sealed room, the next harmless archive is already waiting. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.